So this is going to be the first of a few videos that cover blending textures and tiling strategies to help when you have those situations where you need to cover a lot of ground, or when you need to blend a couple of different textures together and you don't want to be really loading up very high resolution textures for everything. So you'll see what I mean when we get to there, but first things first, let's talk about tiling textures. So I'm sure most of you, if you're watching this, are pretty familiar with the concept of tiling textures, but let's just talk about why we like to do it. And it really comes down to sort of effective screen resolution. One of the things that, if we display our resolution here, this is, sort of our HD resolution, and in this case, 960 by 540. If we're looking at our texture this way, and it's a 1K texture, we're about 1-to-1 here, right? We have 1 pixel of texture resolution to 1 pixel of screen rendering resolution. And this is okay, and you need to think about this kind of thing. The problem is if this was a ground plane and we had a character on it or something we had to get close to, and we dropped ourselves in here, really at this stage we're only dealing with a couple hundred pixels of maybe even just 100 or so pixels of our texture resolution for our screen resolution, which is our render resolution, which is over 900 pixels across. So clearly, if this is 1,000 pixels across, we are really breaking our texture resolution when we get in close. So one of the ways that people will combat this is to use textures that tile. All right, so in Maya, to tile a texture, we move to our Place 2D Texture node, which really just determines how our texture falls into the UV space of our object. In this case, at here, repeat UV, we're at 1 and 1. By pumping this number up to something like 4 and 4, we now have taken our 1K texture and we've given it essentially the amount of resolution that a 4K texture would have, except we are repeating it to get that. But it allows us to get much closer and still retain our 1-to-1 texture resolution, right? So even at this distance here, I'm only using I'm using the texture, the full almost 1-to-1 texture resolution for my screen resolution, except we're in this close, right? So it allows us to get much closer to our object. Now the problem is, of course, that when we do pull away, we will see that repetition happening. So this is an inherent issue with textures, with tiling textures rather. So let me turn off my display resolution here. So how do we combat this? Well, one way to combat it is to think about blending a couple textures together, right? What we want to do is somehow remove this repetition. So how do we do that? Well, I like to use an older utility in Maya called the blend colors. It's under the utilities, blend colors. Here we are. And what this allows me to do is mix 2 tiles together. So I'm going to bring down another tile texture here, another texture that will tile seamlessly. And we're really looking at worst case scenario here, and this will help us help me illustrate the point. I've got some other ones loaded up here ready to go for a little bit later. So let's roll this back and take a look at what blend colors does. I'm going to drop this right onto our color, and you'll notice that we get purple, right? But if we delve into our blend colors, you'll see that we have 2 colors that we can mix together, color 1 and color 2. And I have a blender function here, which is just how much these come together, right? And notice that if we go to 0, we get to color 2, and if we go to 1, we get to color 1. And so we have this ability to mix together 2 textures, 2 colors, right? And of course we can load in textures here, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to load in texture 1 here and texture 2 here, right? And let's regraph thing to keep it organized, right? So here we have our textures loaded in. Now, you'll see that these are blended evenly, right, at 50%, or nearly 50%. And we know that by doing this, we're going to get sort of a loss of contrast because we're just getting sort of a soft blend. And we'll cover that later. But the first thing we want to do is sort of set up our tiles. Now, if I were to go ahead and start tiling this, right, 768, let's tile that 4 times. Maybe that is kind of what we want. And 1024, let's tile that 2 times. Right? Now, 2 things have happened, right? We've gotten a lot more texture information out of this, right? We have sort of mixed resolutions of tiles happening. We can get effectively in fairly close, and we have enough resolution in both of these to support that closer distance. However, notice what we've done. We've created 4 identical tiles because they're going to fall exactly in line 4 times. And that's just simply because of math, right? If we divide 4, which is this, by 2, right, we get 2, which tells us that every 2 tiles we're going to get a complete identical tile. So by looking at how we're repeating things, and this will happen if we do even larger numbers, 20, 20, and 5 and 5, right? Here we can see that every 4 of these tiles will tile into one of the other tiles. This means that no matter how we, if we continue down this path of tiling things this way, we're still creating our repetition. So even though that, once again, we can get in nice and close to our texture here, when we pull away, we're going to get the exact same problem we had before. So how do we break this up? Well, thinking back to middle school math or earlier, we're going to use numbers that don't divide into each other, which are nicely called prime numbers. And I've got a list here of the prime numbers that exist between 0 and 100, and these are the numbers that can be divided only by 1 and themselves, right? There's no way. If we looked at 6, we could divide it by 2 and 3. If we look at 18, we can divide it by 6 and 2 and 3. So we want to be using numbers that can only be divided by themselves and 1. Now this is a really, really handy tool for everything that you might be doing in computer graphics, whether it's texturing or creating animations that need to loop but not match up. Walk cycles, for instance, we can work off of prime numbers so that things just don't line up for a very long time. Now, eventually, they will line up. For example, 3 and 5 will line up at 15, and that's okay. But we're going to worry about things that kind of line up by their, I'd say at their value and below, right? So let's take 7 and 11 here, 2 prime numbers, and see what happens. So I'm going to take my smaller one, which is my 768 texture, and I'm going to put the 11 in here. And I'm going to take my larger one, and I'm going to put 7 in there. Right? And now I've got effectively a 7K texture. But notice what happens here is that we don't have any repetition. Nothing will line up exactly the same way. Now we might get, and we can look at our lines, right? We can look at the border lines I've used to create this. And we can pick some areas. If we come up here, we can say, well, let's line this up here. So it's about the width of my mouse here. So here is 2 lines coming together, and they are lining up from about the width of my mouse box there. And notice how they're lined up. We have 768 to the left of 1024 here. So if we go over to the approximate same area here, they're about the same, right? Same lineup, except now 1024 is to the left of 768. So essentially, we've got a completely non-repeating texture here that covers our whole area. And and we'll do it, we'll stand up to close inspection and far away without any repetition. Now this is all well and good, and you might say, hey, now, wow, we're done. Well, you're not quite done yet. One of the problems, like I said earlier, is that by blending these 50%, we're getting sort of a wash on our color, on our textures, and our and the sharpness of our texture that we've worked so hopefully pretty hard to create. So what do we do about that? Well, what we're going to do is we are going to blend these using a more procedural method, right? And this is pretty great. Let's hop over to here and let's grab one of my favorite procedurals, the noise texture, right? And this is handy for a bunch of reasons, but those will become more clear in a little bit. We'll bring this into here and we'll pop back here. Now let's take a look at this. So what we're going to do for our blend colors here is we're going to drop our procedural right onto this. Plop. And now we've got some mixing happening, okay? And what we really want to be looking for here is the ability to blend together these two tiles, these two tiling textures in a way that breaks up their tiling independently, right? So let's take a look. Well, one of the things about here, I like this purlin noise. It's got a nice mixability to it. And so basically what's happening, you can see, is that this texture here is essentially giving us our 1 and our 0 value for our blender, our blend texture, blend colors node here. So anything we do to this will affect how our texture blends together. And you'll notice that we have a couple of options here that adjust, how we mix these things together, right? We can go full white, full dark, our ratio and our amplitude and our threshold will really change how all of these mix together, right? And it's just want to be looking for a way to generate as little of this blending that's going to create sort of these odd halfway zones as we can, right? So there's a couple ways to do this, and yes, there's many ways to sort of affect this texture, whether it's adjusting my frequency here and the depth, right? We can get a lot of things going here, and you can see that by doing this, we are really starting to break up how these textures blend together, and we're going to even lose more of that repetition that we've had. Ooh, that's looking pretty nasty. Here we go, a little better. So anyway, so we've got a bunch of different methods for doing this. One of the ways, and I've bodged this up pretty good, so I'm just going to create a new one and get to my point. Like I said, we want to kind of avoid some of these, here we go, some of these gray values, so that we don't have quite that mushy feeling as often as we might get it. So one of the ways to do this is to just adjust the contrast of this. Now we have contrast nodes and other things like this in our utilities, but one little method I really like to use because it gives me a lot of control is to take your texture and roll down to effects, and what we want to do is insert a color remap. And what this does is it takes our gray values, because if we look at what happens here, we essentially take in the colors, right? It says out color to an RGB, and then we convert them to HSV, which is hue, saturation, and value, and we take that value out and we feed it to our ramp, okay? Which means that we can take our white values and we can effectively remap them to any color we want, and same with our black values. We can remap those to green, and in between they get a blend. Now, one of the things that I like to use with it is I like to work with it as a little bit more of a color correction node. So we can take our blend colors. I'm going to go ahead and drop this right onto my blender again. And we won't see a change, but here we can start lifting our black values and dropping our white values to increase the contrast of what we're getting out of our noise, right? So you can see that we have our noise feeding into this, and we're just getting a more contrasty version of our noise because we're defining it. And it's nice to do it this way because we won't get peaking values. We won't get values over 1, and we won't get values below 0, which sometimes you can get while manipulating your noise texture. So at this stage, we can start to affect sort of the aspects of the noise texture that we really want to affect, which are like our frequency ratio, which determines how much blending we're doing, our ratio, which gives us a little bit more detail there, our frequency, which can change how we're getting this mix. And as we get that frequency and whatnot mixed in there, we can see sort of which direction we need to go to sort of get a nice even exposure of our two tiles. So here you can see that these things get set up pretty nicely. And yeah, we have some areas that are maybe a little too sharp, and it takes some little tweaking, and that's just part of the game. But what happens now if we start switching these out with file textures? Let's take a look at that now. So let's graph out our node here, and we're just going to bring in 2 different sets of dirt. Here we are, textures. So we have I have 2 dirt tiles here, which I'll bring in. And you'll notice that if I just put 1 on here for the color, right, it looks like this. And if I bring on another, it looks like this, right? Just so you know, another way to look at your textures, if you want to check out how they're doing, is you can always click them and go to Edit, Test Texture, check your resolution here, 1024, and it will send it to the render view. This is really handy in this situation where we can't always tell what's going on here, so we can say Edit, Test Texture. Oh, only textures and utilities. I think this has to be connected. Color. Test texture. There we go. And you can see this. You could also just save this out once you get a good one. So anyways, that's a handy little tip. But we can take our dirt tile 1 and 2. So here's 2. So I'm going to put that into color 2. And here is 1. I'm going to put that into color 1. Right? And I'm going to graph this out again just so we can see it. So here is our dirt texture. Now, the thing to realize is that they are similar colors, so that helps, but we're still also only repeating them 1. So if I come in here, you'll see that the texture breaks down pretty quickly. And I'll pump this up to 7. And I'll pump this one up to 11. So once we get in nice and close, you can see the level of detail that we've got in our dirt texture and how close we can get to it. And when we pull away, you'll see very little evidence of repetition, right? And if we go back to our ramp here, you can see that we can alter our blends. And you can see here how some of that sort of smooths out our detail if we go with too much gray values. And just contrasting it up a little bit will help retain some of those details that we had in our texture. So that is pretty much all I wanted to show for part 1 is sort of this ability to blend together 2 textures and use this blend colors combined with the procedural to give us the ability to have a non-repeating texture across a large open space. And like I said, we can always pop in and see. So we can always just adjust our color balance here. We can see there's where our blends happen. So it might be a little heavy-handed on one side versus the other. Like I said, that's just it's just a matter of figuring out how to make that blend work the best for your particular shaders, right? So here we are, nice and close into our dirt. we can pull out and everything looks pretty hunky-dory with very little repetition. We might catch it here and there, but there's nothing stopping you from adding another blend colors with another set of tiles coming in and blending this to another one. So you can keep cascading these as much as you want. All right, so in the next part, we're going to talk about building this out to a shader, and then how some effective strategies to make sure that everything is remains pretty standard. All right.
Shut up and sit down.